Some of you know that this is my fairy tale. It comes into my classes just about every time. It's in my thesis. I know it very well, and every time I consider talking about it, I see something else. That's a sure sign that it's my fairy tale. The Old Woman in the Wood tonight. You've no doubt heard already that fairy tales can be approached on a number of different levels. They tell us something about the collective consciousness of patriarchy. They can be looked at from a masculine standpoint or from a feminine standpoint. Essentially, I agree with von Franz, who says that there are stories of individuation. They tell us about the soul's journey toward wholeness. And it's useful to consider, at the beginning of a story, what's missing, what's needed. Since they are, by and large, though they've been told and retold for many, many, many generations, formed within patriarchal culture. And you'll notice that in very many of the tales, what's missing at the beginning is the feminine. There will be 3 young sons and a king and perhaps no queen, and the task of the youngest or the task of the sons is to go and find a bride. There will be a king without a wife who imprisons his daughter in a tower. There will be, as in the Handless Maiden, and I'll talk a little bit about that tonight, a daughter essentially driven from the home to find her soul. So the tales will tell what are the trials to be undergone. We'll recognize, some of us, some of the trials in different tales. And they tell us something about the attitude that the ego needs to assume toward the unconscious, toward the self, toward various aspects of the self as they emerge in the story. The tale that we're considering tonight, The Old Woman in the Wood, I think more clearly than most, is the story of a woman's journey. Now, again, there are aspects of the story that can very readily be looked at from the standpoint of the masculine journey. And you all can do a little translating as I go along to see if, in fact, there's a comparable task for the male. And I'll talk a little bit about the similarities and the differences as we go along. So, first I'll tell you the story. It's one of the Grimm's tales. It talks about a young serving girl who is traveling with the family that she serves, and they enter the deep woods in their coach. When they get to the middle of the woods, they're set upon by robbers. And the robbers kill everyone except the serving girl and run off with the wealth that the family was carrying with them. The serving girl escapes, quick-witted, and hides behind a tree until the robbers have gone. Now she's in a pickle. Here she is in the deepest, darkest forest, has no idea how to get out. Even the road that they entered on seems to have vanished because she cannot find her way. She exhausts herself in the attempt, and finally, as evening falls, she leans against a tree and resolves to put her fate in the hands of God, come what may. She just sort of gives up and waits. Before long, she's approached by a dove. And the dove has in its beak a golden key. And the dove speaks to her and says, "This key will open the tree that you see before you." And she does. And inside the tree is a small bowl of milk and all the good bread she should want. After she's eaten her fill, the dove gives her a second key, which opens a second tree, and inside this tree is a clean white bed. And she lies down and falls asleep. When she wakes in the morning, the dove is there and shows her a third tree. When she opens that tree, she finds garments set with rubies and diamonds and pearls, grander even than a princess might wear. She puts on the beautiful things. And there she stays for a while, living in the woods, provided with everything that she needs. A quiet, good life, the fairy tale calls it. Until finally one day, the dove comes to her and says, "Now will you do something for me?" And she says, "With all my heart." Now he tells her that there lives in the woods an old woman. And he asks her to go to the house of the old woman. And he tells her that in the house of the old woman, she will find, among many other rich jewels, a plain gold ring. And he asks her to bring back the plain gold ring. He says that the old woman will try to stop her, but she is to pass by on the right side, saying nothing, and go in and find the ring and return. So he points the way. Maybe you know by now that's one of the good offices of the Animus. And she goes to the house of the old woman, and sure enough, there she sits on her doorstep. And she says, "You can't go in there. That's my house." But the girl goes ahead, and the old woman doesn't stop her. Now, inside the house, she sees heaps of jewelry. And she wonders, how in the world is she going to find a plain gold ring amid the riches? And she's feeling very discouraged and a little afraid, when lo and behold, she sees the old woman tippy-toeing out of the house, carrying a bird cage. In the bird cage is a bird, and in the bill of the bird is the plain gold ring. So she nerves herself up, and she goes right on up to the old woman, and she opens the bird cage, and she takes the ring, and she runs back to where she left the dove. And she expects to find him waiting, but he's not there. So once again, she waits. She leans back against a tree, only to feel it soften, and arms fold around her, and lo and behold, you've already guessed, it's a prince. And he tells her that he had been enchanted by the old woman, he and all his men and all their horses. But she has broken the spell. And so she mounts a horse, and they ride out of the forest together, accompanied by all the men and horses of the prince, and were married and lived happily. I think this story doesn't say ever after. Lived happily. Well, there are some things about this tale that you'll recognize immediately, no doubt, not the least of which is the prince. The task, the plain gold ring. Have you encountered one of those in the tales that have been presented so far? No. And the happy ending. So let's see what we can make of it. The initial situation. A servant girl serving a kind of an anonymous family. They call her a poor serving girl. The story does. She's of a class with little power, low status. Represents, I think, the situation of the undeveloped ego held in the collective, unquestioning, doing her job for the family. And of course they enter the forest. Forest, as you must have heard, if you attend any Jungian things at all, is a long-standing image of the unconscious. It's a good one. It's dark, mysterious, possibly dangerous. But above all, it's a place where birds and animals and all manner of living things grow without any kind of reference to human law, unfettered, but orderly. What's missing? Say it out loud.
Men.
In the initial situation, we can presume there's a father of the family, but it's not mentioned. It's just a family. The personal family is missing. What can you imagine that might bespeak psychologically? Any suggestions?
Well, she's in service of others without doing anything for herself. She is with a family that doesn't really belong to her. She has duties and obligations that aren't really that don't really belong to her.
Yeah.
You know, maybe she had no choice in this, but poor servant girl, you know, it could have just been more of a fatalistic thing that cast her into this situation.
I think by and large it is a matter of not much choice. We find ourselves in the collective. And her connection to her own mother, her own father, doesn't appear. And we can imagine, perhaps, that it suggests a situation many of us encounter when first we begin to consider our situations. A kind of a broken connection with the ground of our being. Her situation in the collective is presumably secure enough, as long as she doesn't expect too much. Now then, the robbers. That's a very rich theme. They are collective shadow, or at least that's one level of interpretation. Von Franz speaks of the robbers that appear in the tale of Apuleius, and she says they're men who won't submit to father's state. They're violent, they're dangerous, they take what they want. That's shadow of the collective. That's very shadowy for men, and it's doubly shadowy for women. Yeah, Margaret?
Everything you're saying, then, they're stealing things from her that don't even belong to her, as in the family, which is her only connection, even though it's a disconnection.
Mm-hmm. There's a way in which you could say they're making it obvious what her situation is. She really has nothing of her own. And now she has to face that. But robbers are a kind of though they look very dangerous and deadly in this story, they are a kind of a double good and bad possibilities in robbers. We tend to be fascinated with robbers. We make heroes out of Billy the Kid and the James boys and Robin Hood, who is in the business of redistributing the wealth, taking from the collective, from the official authorities, and distributing it to the outcasts. Well, I think we get into a little trouble when we idealize the actual ones out there. But we do that because there's something archetypally significant, something real in that vision. Have you recently seen The Runaway Train? Anybody see that? A wonderful movie. These are a couple of men in a maximum security prison in Alaska, of all the godforsaken landscapes you've ever seen in this movie, dead of winter. And they escape. And they find their way to a train, and they're going to ride the train out, only it turns out that the engine, or the brakes are not functioning, and the engineer has a heart attack, and they're on a runaway train. But the thing about this guy, as dangerous as he is that he has a kind of an uncompromising integrity, oddly enough. A determination to be true to himself, no matter what. No matter what. And that's something else that the outcast can convey, the robber. Another one I liked was the Gray Fox. Anybody seen that? There's a train robber. A very lovable fellow. And you're delighted when he wins. But he's a train robber and a killer. But he, too, has this kind of uncompromising integrity, personal integrity. Again, you don't expect to find that in Juliet, but in archetypal images, you certainly do. There's something about the outsider who refuses to be broken. I wonder if you can begin to see how this kind of anonymous figure may be useful to the servant girl. She is an outsider, really. She serves others, and she needs to find the will to stand for herself and take what she wants. It's one of the scariest things women are called upon to do in the individuation process. To be selfish. We often encounter robbers, both men and women, dreamers, and women's dreams are often breaking in. And you run around and try and lock the doors, and you can't lock them. And you close one, and it's coming in the window. Men also have dreams of delinquents or criminals who are chasing them. Men also have to come to terms with their own aggressive instincts. It's shadowy for men, too. But as I said, doubly so for women. A little more about thieves. Von Franz talks about them as the servants of the great goddess. And she compares them to the satyrs and Kabiri, who appear with the images of the goddess. They were guardians, these figures, of the divine child, of the self. And they also represented a kind of primitive masculinity, a chthonic male virility, madness and creativity. Men have to find this also, but it's very much in the dark. There are some gods who image these figures pretty well. Dionysus, of course. Hades, from the underworld. And incidentally, of course, in the story of Persephone, that dark figure appears and drags her off violently. And Hermes, who is the god of thieves, whose first action immediately after his birth was to run out and steal Apollo's cattle, who was very much attached to his mother and assured her that they would make their way. If he couldn't get what they needed one way, he would get it another. Ultimately, Apollo and Hermes are reconciled. But he's a very tricky fellow. He's the image also of the trickster. But on the other hand, Hermes is the messenger of the gods and the psychopomp, the guide of souls. That's a puzzling figure, as all archetypes with both sides, and like the thieves as well. Okay, how are these? Yes.
I have a question.
Good.
You're referring to the robbers as shadows of the collective consciousness. Typically, so it's not the shadow of the feminine figure; it's the shadow of the collective consciousness.
Well, it's a multiple thing. It's the shadow of the collective. It's masculine shadow, and you can see how those two are related. The ideal masculine, that the good father and so forth, is not a robber, but there is that greed underneath. An anonymous figure, or a collection of them, which is also often the case for women early in their dreams. They appear in bunches. Jung, I'm not sure if this is true, but I'll mention it. Jung said that, observed in his work, that women often have multiple animus figures, whereas men tend to have one anima figure at a time, anyway. So, her animus, but also very much, as they say, contaminated by shadow, her deepest shadow. Now, my feeling about animus figures is that they, in fact, do carry those qualities which are the farthest removed from feminine consciousness. It isn't that there aren't these possibilities that are authentically feminine. It's that they are so far from feminine persona. Jung also said, in a passage that I like to quote, it's like the Bible, you can find what you want, that the anima is compensatory to masculine persona. Now that's saying something pretty important. It's saying, and the way he put it was that the picture of a man as he is ideally, the persona, is compensated by feminine weakness. So, the picture of a woman as she is, or has been in the past, ideally, is compensated by masculine power. Now, that's my addendum. He didn't say that. But you see that this relativizes anima and animus. Sometimes we're inclined to think of these as somehow archetypally masculine or archetypally feminine figures. But what appears as feminine for a man is really what's the most buried in himself. What appears as masculine for a woman is what is most distant from ego. So the first thing that she encounters, and this is a very rough awakening, by the way, is this deepest kind of shadow, doubly denied in a woman, not just assertive and, what was it Jung said, masculinity is knowing what you want and taking steps to get it. Well, they knew what they wanted. But it's not only that. It's doing it no matter what. It's doing it without regard to the welfare of others. This is very shadowy for women, very. Not that we don't do those things, see, but that we can't let ourselves know it. So it's important to find it out. But when you do, and when you are divorced, in fact, from all the collective supports, the image of yourself as competent, say, knowing what to do, knowing how to get around, knowing where you're headed, being cared for, all gone. Some of us have encountered that dark night of the soul. She does her damnedest to get out of this mess. As in the tale of Psyche and Eros, she tries and she tries. But as with Psyche, she winds up saying, this is a quote, "What's a poor girl like me to do now?" And she realizes that she has to give up trying to figure it out. Well, that's very tough. Now, that's tough for both men and women. And this part of the story is talking about something both men and women go through, or may go through, when persona cracks, and when the customary image of self is broken. This kind of giving up is found very frequently in the stories of women, in the fairy tales that have heroines. And it's prominent in the story of Psyche, too. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. Again, if you've been attending Jungian things, you've heard about it many times. She has 3 tasks, and each one seems ultimately impossible. And each time she's about ready to kill herself or give up. It's too much. But each time something outside of ego comes to the rescue. Now, because giving up and relying on something outside of self is rather more acceptable in women than in men, there's a particular kind of difficulty for men who are faced with this necessity. It's different than it is for women. It's god-awful for anybody. But a man has to give up his idea of masculinity. Now that is a very profound sacrifice. The dark night of the soul, the undergoing, the swallowing, being swallowed by the whale. This is a different kind of journey than the hero's journey. This is more of a going back to source. This is more of a giving up. The hero has got always accoutrements, and he often has, already in place Athena or somebody who's going to help him out. The man who has to do the undergoing, be swallowed by the whale, and endure that is in a different position, and the reconstruction, therefore, is much more profound. The hero is a kind of a collective. That's fine in the collective. You may be familiar with Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces. That's a story of the finding of masculine identity. The hero goes out and finds himself and then brings back what he can give to the collective. He has to defeat some scary things in order to do that, but they're trials that he is more or less prepared for. The night sea journey, the dark night of the soul, is a different thing. And it's ultimately, possibly, a much more creative thing, because it throws into question all the assumptions of the collective consciousness. They're all gone. The servant girl says, I will put myself in God's hands and wait, come what may. In the time of the story, that was perhaps easier than it is now, a more common possibility than it is for contemporary men and women. When we make this inner journey, it's often because, in fact, the God of our fathers is not a living reality to us anymore, and we have to find something else to found ourselves in, what Jung called the self. Does it seem unusually warm in here? No. Okay. I'm perspiring. So, we're talking about ego giving up and relying on self. This, again, is a very difficult thing, and we can't do it usually alone. We need a companion of some sort on this kind of journey, someone to report to, someone to understand where we are, not somebody to say, oh, come on, it's all right, you're okay, but somebody just to be present to the despair that we feel, to know that it makes sense, to know that it's a fruitful possibility in our lives, but not to urge us toward any wonderful outcome, not to show us the way. We have to find it ourselves. That's the hope in analysis, that you will find such a companion, but there are others. Eliot, in the Four Quartets, expresses the position that you're in at this time. In one passage, he says, I said to my soul, be still and wait. Wait without hope, for hope would be hope for the wrong thing. Wait without love, for love would be love of the wrong thing. There is yet faith, but the faith and the love and the hope are all in the waiting.
That comes from
Eliot, the Four Quartets. Yeah. Now, you probably had von Franz's fairy tale books suggested to you. I also add my recommendation. Those books were transcriptions of lectures, and they contain questions and answers, and they're very easy to read. Not in the sense that they're not deep, but because they are in that mode of presentation of a dialogue. She observed, I think talking about the handless maiden, that if a woman has a powerful enough negative animus, that is to say, one who threatens, as these robbers did, we can sit here and talk about how they really are fruitful, but if you encounter figures like that in a dream, you're not going to think so. If you are struggling with a sufficiently powerful negative animus, sometimes the only thing you can do is to run away and hide. And as the girl in this story did, and as the handless maiden did, wait until the connection to the feminine self grows strong enough to permit an encounter with the masculine without being possessed by it. Now, there are a lot of forms that possession can take. She escapes it. She runs away and hides. Have you talked about the handless maiden this time around? briefly, it's a story of a miller's daughter. The miller has fallen on hard times, and he goes off on a journey to see if he can improve his fortunes. And in the middle of the woods, he encounters a dark man who says to him, "I can bring you fortune. All you have to do is promise me whatever is now standing behind your mill." And the miller thinks a minute. The only thing back there is that old tree. Well, all right. He's a little bit afraid of this fellow, but he's desperate, so he agrees. When he goes home and tells his wife what's happened, she says, "You fool, your daughter was standing back there." That's about the last we hear of the mother in this story. And indeed, the day comes when the devil comes. That's who he is. Now, there's a negative animus, to collect the daughter. Here again we have shadow, very much shadow, deepest shadow of the collective. And he comes to take her away. Well, this is too powerful altogether. She weeps and weeps, and her tears fall upon her hands, and they purify her, and he can't grab her. Well, he comes back a time or two more, and finally he's enraged, and he says to the miller, "You must chop off her hands." Now, the miller says to the girl, "Oh, dear, this is terrible. But what can we do?" And, of course, the dutiful daughter says, "Dear Daddy, rather than let this bad man get you, you can chop off my hands." And the miller does, and the devil comes, and she's still weeping on the stumps, and he still can't take her away, so he goes off. Now, the miller is all gratitude and says, "We'll take care of you the rest of your life." And she says, "No, I don't think so. I believe I had better leave." So she goes off. Now, she's been thrust out of the collective also, and something has been revealed to her that would be very hard to face. One of the toughest jobs we have on the road to individuation is to see clearly what we have endured, to see clearly how, in fact, we have suffered, to deal with the failures of our parents, to pass through the rage and go on. It's a very tough thing to do. Again, I'm talking a lot about tough things tonight. But it's essential to see, in fact, what has happened. So she goes off and wanders and finds herself finally in the garden of a king's son, and there she reaches up and can't quite reach the pears, and an angel comes and feeds her. It's like our dove in this story. And king's servant sees this and runs off and tells the king, because he doesn't want the king to think he's stealing the pears, I think. So the king comes and watches, and he sees, sure enough, this beautiful young woman and the angel feeding her, and on the spot he proposes marriage. Don't encounter an animal like that too often either. So he has her fitted out with silver hands. Now see, the angel and the king are a little bit like the dove in our story. They provide a shelter and a means of going on with life. But the day comes when the young king has to go off to the wars, and his wife is pregnant, and he tells his old mother to be sure and send him word when the child is born. She does. The devil intercepts the message and sends one saying that the child is a monster, and then intercepts the king's message back and says to the mother, "You must destroy this child and her mother." And the queen mother, the young king's mother, won't do that, and sends her off into the forest. Here is her second downgoing, and this is a deeper one. And there she lives for a long time, while the devil is still trying to cause trouble, until her hands grow back. And the king finds her, and again, it's all happily ever after. There is this having to go away. I'll tell you a dream. There are many ways that women have to do this. You know, there are many levels of going away, finding space. Virginia Woolf spoke of a room of one's own. If you can manage that, you may not have to go to the woods. Nowadays, there are a number of divorces which come about because it's not possible for the woman to manage that. She has to go further away in order to find herself. And that's confusing to everybody. She can't always point to anything very readily. Maybe the man is a solid citizen, good to the children, does not mess around, is not abusive. But she finds, I'm thinking of a specific instance, that she can't breathe in this house. It never has felt like her house. everything is his. When she thinks of a project to do, he immediately begins to help, and he takes over. And it's very kind and very good looking from the outside, and she can't imagine why she can't be a good wife to such a good man. But the necessity to become oneself is very powerful, and it can drive you even out of such a apparently comfortable arrangement. There was a graduate student. We're going to greater and greater degrees of having to move away here. A brilliant young woman, had a fellowship and was making all A's in her chosen program. A perfectionist, driven, never satisfied with what she did, and feeling less and less safe. Finally, she had a dream in which her father is shooting down a collection of kittens, and a darker man behind him. And he gives her the gun and requires her to shoot the ones that survive. And she does, all but one. This young woman was very close to suicide. And that one she takes and says, I will keep this to remind me what I have done. She quit her program. It's very difficult. See, the wife and the student both are in favored places and sheltered places in the collective. They are valued, apparently. They are rewarded, but they are in dread danger because they are further and further removed from the self. And the only way they can find that is to give up all of this. Some of you may have read about Inanna, the descent of the goddess, Pereira. On the way down to the dark goddess, she has to give up all the signs of her power and beauty and wonderfulness in the collective. This young woman, in fact, as I say, quit the program. People said, you must be crazy. She thought she must be crazy, but she knew she had to do it. And unplugged her telephone and was not in touch with anybody except me. And she would continue to come for analysis. There was that one companion for this down going. And gradually, she began to take some joy in her life again. That's pretty drastic, going away from all the friends, the boyfriend, everything. And it says a great deal about the way in which ultimately we are founded, that one can survive this. The self will guide and support a journey like that. A little bit about dove. Of course, it's an image of the Holy Spirit, God's messenger, and in that way the light side of Hermes. She has survived the attack of the darkest masculine, and now she is visited by Hermes winged. Lord of thought, Jung called him, God of revelation, and sovereign psychopomp. But he's also the dove, the typical bird of the great goddess, and appeared with the love goddesses of Asia Minor and Crete, ancient Greece. So, an image both of Logos and of Eros. Yes? That's Athena. Different goddesses have different birds, as different gods have different birds. The key, of course, is like a phallic opener, but it's also an attribute of Hecate, a dark goddess of crossroads, witchcraft. Hecate was the goddess who saw what had become of Persephone and joined her mother on the search. Well, we're about up to the 3 trees. Let's see where we are. 1 hour. Let's take a break and then we'll... Tree is, in the alchemical work, an image or a symbol of the transformation of the base metal into gold. Tree is associated, of course, with the mother also. And these, more plainly than others, perhaps, is within the tree, within the first tree, is mother's milk. the milk of human kindness. It's even used as an image of Sophia's wisdom. There's an ancient, well, not so ancient actually, but perhaps medieval, depiction of Sophia and the milk of wisdom pouring from her breast, and the prophets and whatnot are underneath being fed by this. And of course, bread, very fundamental. Demeter's grain has spiritual meaning also in the communion wafer, which is the fruit of the earth, work of human hands, and the body of Christ. So she's fed with both material and spiritual riches in this first tree, and that it's in a little dish kind of emphasizes her relation sort of as child to mother in this moment of the tale. And in the womb of the mother is a clean white bed. That raises images of childhood for me. One of the nicest things was having a bath and then going and getting in the clean sheets. And there she rests. And when she wakens to the possibility of transformation. It's like a ritual of death and rebirth. And of course, in the third tree is the garment of a princess. And yet she's not ready to act as a princess. There's the waiting time again. Well, 3 is certainly the image or the number of transformation, dynamic number. And there are 3 goddesses, the maiden, the mother, and the crone, 3 ages of women, the graces, the muses, 3 or 9, multiple of 3. There is, of course, the Trinity. There are 3 tasks in Amor and Psyche and I don't know how many fairy tales. And here there are 3 trees. On the surface, it's a much more passive image. And I do think that this tale talks about a deeper downgoing, and that takes us back to childhood. But there are risks still at each one of these stages. We know a certain amount now about the symbolic meaning of food through Marion Woodman's studies of eating disorders and others, Kim Chernin. We hunger for nurture, and we concretize that. It's one of the risks of each of these steps, that we can find ourselves driven to enact out there what must ultimately be an inner experience. The retreat to the bed, that can be risky too. People are often terrified of inactivity because they're afraid that once they surrender, they'll never be able to act again. So powerful is the longing for secure rest. And indeed, we can become enamored of inactivity. We can be caught in inactivity. Many of us experience that great effort to manifest anything in the world as too much. Both men and women who are unable to move out of the home, for instance, unable to enact a work, great at beginnings perhaps, but falling back into the dark, which seems safe, but if you stay too long, it is a prison. Well, that doesn't happen, of course, in the fairy tale. It need not happen to us. Another young woman who had an experience sort of between waking and sleeping of an old woman. Old women do appear in women's dreams a lot. They often do not appear in a guise of power, but this image was one of power. Spun the girl around, made her dizzy, and laughed. said something about, you'll have to get to know. And she found herself unable to function. She would wake up in the morning and be violently nauseated and dizzy, and would just have to go back to bed. That really frightened her, imagine. But again, if you allow, it had gotten to that point because this was a young woman, like many young and old women, who was always smiling and active and doing good and never thinking of herself. It was a false self, and in order to discover her true self, she had to undergo this dismantling of her customary routine, not respond to the needs of others. It was humiliating to her and frightening. But as she permitted this process to go forward and attended to the images that came and the dreams, gradually she began to grow stronger. If we don't surrender when we are so plainly required to, we do become very ill. So, an undergoing of a retreat on her part, as with this young woman, led to the beginnings of transformation. But you can see the kind of progression here, and the risk of this last, when it would appear that transformation has occurred, maybe you can guess what that might be. There's a risk of inflation. There's a risk of identifying with the energy that is released after the retreat. There's a risk of kind of a restoration of persona. Now I can do it again, and I can do it even better, and you can forget the downgoing. The tale says that she stays there for some while. And as a matter of fact, there isn't any once for all. One trip through this transformative process, and now we got it. We have to do this over and over again, with varying degrees of intensity, perhaps. And she stays there for a while, so we can imagine that she experiences over and again the nourishment, the rest, the sleep, the rising to new energy and new possibility before it's matured enough, before she becomes conscious, and perhaps this is where some knowledge comes in, conscious enough of the process and of what she has received, and we could guess the meaning of it all, to take the next step. What's been missing so far is any image of feminine shadow. Serving girl is very sweet and compliant and trusting and loving and childlike. She can do this trip for the dove with all her heart. There's no suggestion of doing anything for herself. So now she goes to visit the old woman. And here we have an image of feminine self. Those aspects of self which are relegated to shadow. They are aspects of power. If you reflect on this story, you can kind of see that it's all in her hands. Her forest, her robbers. I think that's where the pile of jewelry came from. Her trees, her enchantment, her dove. She enchants the prince, but she allows him to fly around every day as a dove and to visit this girl and to work his own freedom as a consequence. She stands at the door and says, "You may not enter, this is my house," but it's kind of like the guardians of the temple. If you're put off at that point, you shouldn't go in. If you're frightened, it's not time yet. When it's time, you can go past the guardian into that inner sanctuary. And of course, the plain gold ring is a symbol of selfhood. It's that wholeness. And again, you're not to make any mistake. It's not all that fancy. One's self, one's experience of self. It's a plain gold ring. But it's what's needed to create the freedom to act. That contact with the self. Now, We've been hearing a lot about goddesses in the last several years, and of the importance of goddesses to women's experience of individuation. Probably familiar with Boland's book, many forms the goddess can take in a woman's life. Pereira's book about the descent of Inanna to a dark goddess. But for thousands of years, the image of feminine power and authority has been obscured. It's only now beginning to emerge. Even now, the major images of power and authority are masculine. And when a woman moves to acquire some, those are the major models. And often it can take her away from self. You may have heard of something called the imposter phenomenon in high-achieving women. Some studies have been done. These are regular psychologists, you can tell from the language, not Jungians. But very useful. Recognition that there are many high-achieving women who go around feeling like they're going to be found out and who can't really do enough to feel confident of their abilities. It's because they have yet to connect them with a feeling of feminine. In our culture, feminine is almost pejorative when it's not being urged upon us. So, it's a very important journey to find a foundation for personal authority which is not masculine. And until very recently, and still in all our psychology really, it's in the shadow. You have to go deep into the unconscious. You have to go into the underworld. You have to face some frightening images to find it. Not the least of which are the marauding robbers. You recover, if you survive, a sense of the capacity to stand for yourself. All that feminine power and authority moved into images of witch in all the fairy tales. And there are a number of them. Again, it's von Franz speaks of talks about the fairy tale of beautiful Vasilisa. It's a Russian fairy tale. And the Baba Yaga, the powerful witch who lives in the depths of the forest and whose house is surrounded by a fence of human skulls and bones, who speaks of my night, my day, a goddess of life and death. But the witches have been somewhat trivialized over the years since they really scared people. And now we have witches on television who crinkle their noses, and we have cute little Halloween witches. But these don't begin to convey the sense of dread that we all can feel when we approach an image or have an experience of feminine power. It needs to be brought into the world. Now, it's noteworthy how much of this story seems to take place in the unconscious. And a great deal of the girl doesn't even know what's going on until the prince tells her, what she's been able to accomplish. The knowledge of what she has done is very late in coming. And even so, she rides off, presumably to enter his kingdom. That's what was available. In the story of Amor and Psyche, even though they are reunited at the end of her travails, he has to rescue her from the darkness, and their marriage is celebrated in heaven, not on earth. We speak about androgyny, Jungians do a lot, and this tale, when I first read it in Zurich, of course, what I saw was, oh, good, a wonderful experience of the animus, and now she's ready to act in the world. And all those images of spirit and knowledge and strength and energy that are in the thing, except for the witch, and she doesn't figure very much. She's obviously got it, but tippy-toe by her and run out again and rejoin the prince, and move into his kingdom. But that all seemed to me like the goal. Androgyny is achieved, here's prince and princess, and they're going out together. And that's why many fairy tales are regarded as, you can look at them from either way, because the point is always seems to be for the masculine to get the feminine, for the feminine to get the masculine, and then wholeness is achieved, supposedly. But fact of the matter is, as I'm trying to suggest, it's not true androgyny because it's not equal. She's still moving into his space. Cinderella is still going to move into the princess, the king's palace. Psyche is raised to heaven. But the equality, the co-creative, equal authority, masculine, feminine, that's presumed in the image of androgyny, is yet to be very widespread on Earth. I would like to think that we're finding our way to it, but we have a lot of work to do yet. There's a book out recently called How Men Feel by Anthony Ostrakhan, I think it must be pronounced, a journalist who spent several years now interviewing, I think he said 4,000 men, about how they feel about the changes that are happening. It's a dandy book. He and his informants are all, pretty honest fellows about how frightening it is and how it threatens their sense of masculine identity. You see, masculine identity and feminine identity have depended upon this arrangement whereby the possibilities are divided up and the men have the authority and women may have power, but it's sub rosa. The power behind the throne. Any overt expression of it is frowned upon, or has been. Of course, I'm 59 years old. When I grew up, of course it was frowned upon. How are we going to find our way to a place wherein, not that men reclaim their feminine or women develop their masculine, but that each of us develop a whole relationship to self, a feminine self which includes all these possibilities, and not all of them wonderfully admirable, and a masculine self that is grounded in the earth and can acknowledge its ties to it and its vulnerabilities. So both men and women can claim strengths and weaknesses. Women won't be mad at men if they're not superachievers. Men won't be afraid of women if they're superachievers. The kind of thing I'm talking about. Hopefully that's where we're moving. The end of our story is what the end of the story has been. They ride off together, and they will go into his kingdom. A happy ending, but only to that chapter of the story, I think. Well, now, questions? Comments? Yes.
If the tree is the feminine symbol, then why at the end, when they discover the ring, does the tree turn into the masculine?
He's been enchanted as a tree. And I want to be kind of clear. There's no such thing as one meaning for an image like a tree. As he pointed out, there are some masculine trees. In this story, the trees that she enters seem pretty clearly to be mother images. That's all. Not that trees are only that. It depends upon the context. Yeah. Like our dreams. Depends upon the context and the individual life, what a given image will mean. You often learn a lot by reference to these meanings in fairy tales and in the myths, but they don't tell us what our individual dream means. They only give us some means of walking around the dream to see it. There is an interesting aspect of this tale, and of many others, I think, that the action moves from masculine to feminine. It seems to be the case that you'll see this, I think, in your dreams often as well, to be an emphasis on masculine figures. And hopefully some kind of shift goes on in the way we connect to those figures. And then there'll be an emphasis on the feminine. And at each of these shifts, something more positive or something more powerful can occur. Something deeper is discovered until finally the self. We don't relate to these in opposition to one another, but in a kind of a meandering way, back and forth.
I have a simple question.
Uh-oh.
Why does the feminine aspect of power get transposed or projected over to the witch image? If I understand, that's what you said happens, and I'm trying to understand what are the psychological dynamics that cause that to occur.
Well, I've come to think of our society, our culture, as a kind of expression of masculine psyche. It's masculine psyche writ large. What is the journey of a man, the developmental story of the male? He begins from the mother, but in order to find himself, he has to repudiate her and start out on a journey away from her power and toward the power of the father. That's the hero's journey. He has to emphasize that discrimination, that difference, that objectivity, and he has to leave her power behind. The move of there's a book called The Fear of Women by Wolfgang von Lederer, which is a nice expression of the uneasiness. I mean, it's a whole book talking about the fear men have. When I first read that, I felt sort of transformed. I was still in my nice little daughter phase. I mean, I was 40 years old, but 35. But to realize that I was fearful was wonderful. I remember walking down the street thinking, yeah. It wasn't long after that I realized I wasn't wonderful. I wasn't totally sweet and understanding and giving. I wasn't wonderful. I remember telling the man I was with at the time, guess what? And what that meant was that he didn't have to be nice to wonderful little me. We had to meet, on a kind of an equal basis. But I don't know if I answered your question. I think because feminine power threatens a man with his vulnerability and his ancient memories of dependence and incapacity. So.
Well, what does the witch do for relieving that pressure?
Well, because she's out there, you can forget about her. I mean, most of the time she's in the unconscious for both men and women. A lot of the fairy tales end with terrible things being done to the witch, you may remember. Still an effort to do away with this threat.
I don't know if this will help your question or not, but it seems like the shadow, the elements seem to contain sort of potential seeds for positive anima or animus, depending on whether you're man or woman. Is that right? It seems to be in the story.
The shadow contained the seed for positive.
Well, I know in general, yeah. I mean, certainly that's where you go to look for wider egos. Okay. But it seems, as you said, the shadow, this collective shadow stuff, it was kind of like a Hermes figure in the sense that it can cause a lot of harm, but it's like the Felix Culpa. It's the lucky accident. And it sets you up to confront and form a, is that in general true that the shadow material is productive for animus or anima development?
Yes.
I have a follow-up question. Does the use of good witches and bad witches, say in The Wizard of Oz, indicate a change in our cultural thinking about witches?
I don't know, maybe so. It was the good witch Glinda, and yeah. It's a wonderful movie, isn't it? Maybe so. Glinda does, yes. Yeah.
There's two of them, aren't there?
Yes, Benny Barnes, I think, was it Benny Barnes? Was the good witch.
The good witch was not my idea of a positive image of power.
She was twittery, wasn't she? Yeah.
Oh, maybe she's undifferentiated at this point. She doesn't have any shadow.
No, the shadow was all on the other side.
That's right. It was a split.
Were there ultimately 4 witches?
Yes.
Oh, that's right. Yes, that's right. Each direction. Yeah.
Which put together would be.
I wanted to bring up the parallel functions of the robbers and the adult, and maybe you would comment on it. Both of them pull this young woman out of a secure place and force her out on her own. And I'm wondering if this is a transformation of shadow material into something more positive that's being hinted at, or if it's simply a device.
A device?
Yeah.
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, a story device. I mean, you need something to keep the plot moving.
Oh, heavens, this is heresy. Do you realize the notion is, the assumption is that in dreams and in fairy tales, there's no such thing as just a plot device. It all has meaning.
Devices have meaning.
Yeah, well, maybe then I'm not understanding.
Maybe Jungian.
Yeah, well, that's quite true, but you're in a Jungian class.
We're just a device. It's not a story that would hang around. It's not to me that if something gets remembered, it's because it's more than just.
Yeah. Well, yes, that's also the notion with that von Franz pushes very strongly, that these are stories that have been told and retold and refined hundreds of years, and what remains is the bare bones, which is kind of an archetype. Why is it satisfying? Why is the runaway train so satisfying? I mean, there's some things that are satisfying not just because they're cleverly told, but because they grab something inside you. And the old woman in the wood may not grab everybody the way she did me, obviously. But, yeah.
This is on your comment. That I'm wondering if you could comment about the way the prince, the dove who becomes the prince, how he commented on his waiting in that sense. Yes, he integrates the feminine in that way. I'm wondering if you could comment on how he shows the development of feminine attributes, and also how the princess too. Well, maybe it's just by going out and seizing the ring. I guess that's her task. That's the way she showed positive animus. And maybe you could comment on how that's a real kind of more masculine logos.
Yeah. My reading of this story is that, and of dreams generally too, when masculine figures appear in a woman's dream, aside from what I said about their carrying possibly qualities that are very far from her ego position, they are residents of the deep unconscious for that reason, and they know their way around. Now that may sound simplified, but I think it really, you can see it. It's often the case that in dreams a male figure will show the way. And really that's the fundamental function, as I see it, of either anima or animus figure, is to lead the way deeper, to point the way to something deeper. Not to hang around to be the mate of the journeying soul, really, but ultimately to just point the way to what you need in order to integrate those qualities. Yeah. Yeah.
I want to say something about the dove again, if I might.
Sure.
It seems to me the dove does more than point the way. He gives her a kick in the ass. Because she's totally dependent on this dove for sustenance.
You didn't hear. He said, will you do something?
Yeah,
Now wait. That's a long way from a kick in the ass. In the first instance, yes.
Let me finish my point. My point is this. If somebody that you're totally dependent on asks you to do them a favor, they may put it in that form. But it seems to me that given that situation, it's like, you better do it or else. Plays, phrase very nicely. It's like when your boss
Here's your
says,
shadow.
would you do this? It's just a nice way to disguise an order.
Yeah, but see, it's not just, he's not the one with the bread and the milk and the bed and the raiment.
But
all
he's given her the way.
That's all. That's all.
And given her the key.
That's right. He said, he said, here, see how? And she had to use the key. He could give it to her. And lots of times we have ways pointed out to us. I think of someone's dream of an emaciated child chained to an old crone. Without going into a whole lot of stuff, the point of the dream was the child said to the dreamer, you have the key. She wasn't ready to use it. You have to be ready to use it. Now, Imagine you're in this huge hall and someone has given you a key and there's the door. You're not always going to be ready to unlock that door. Same way with a tree. We're reading it from the standpoint we know, sort of. But when she confronts the tree, and even, how many times do you mistrust what turns up in your dreams? I don't know what this is going to lead to, or the opportunities that appear. Sometimes you have to have a catastrophe, and you have to encounter something like those robbers, whether you're male or female. But I don't think that she remained totally dependent upon the dove. I think that she was dependent upon what she was receiving in the trees. And it was neat to have that companion, but I don't think she was dependent upon him. And I don't think she was, that's another thing about figures in fairy tales, and I think most of the time in dreams, they don't pretend. I don't think she was pretending when she said, with all my heart. There is such a thing as a willingness to go, even when you don't know what's next. And she didn't. She knew it was an old woman down there, but she didn't know what she couldn't. He wasn't going with her. There is a time when we get ready for that. I can remember saying, something has been given to me, and something is required, and I say yes. Get a little grandiosity in this. There was.
Gifts always incur obligation.
Well,
That's the nature of the gift.
But if you say, I'm ready for what comes now, I will go, the gift is from the self, and there is some obligation, all right. I do believe that. I believe if you don't use your gifts, you're going to get sick. But it's not an obligation to you or to her. It's an obligation to something bigger, which we used to call God, and Jungians call the self. It's an obligation, all right, and it requires a commitment. Another book, Linda Leonard's latest book, is called On the Way to the Wedding, and although I have some uneasiness about part of it, the latter chapters, when she talks about commitment and the vow, are apropos here. You make a vow to the other, not necessarily to a human other out there, but to the work, to the self, to something you don't know, but you are willing to do what's necessary.
Is that right?
Who's
the author?
Linda Leonard.
Are there any tales where the woman ends up, by herself, sort of happy, or, like the man, the man who rides off on his horse in the distance? Or
See, in the fairy tales, the men don't ride off by themselves,
I know, but I'm just...
and the women don't either. In our folklore, of course, there are the cowboys who do.
But I mean, in the fairy tales, are there any, are there always...
Now, the purpose, the thrust of all the fairy tales is she said, is the masculine must find the feminine must find the masculine. But I really believe it's on the way to something deeper. Robert Bly has written about Iron Hands, a fairy tale, which is about the hairy man that lives at the bottom of a pond and that a young boy finds and represents that a kind of buried phonic masculinity that a boy must find, or a man must find, to be whole in himself. Not to require a woman to carry earth, but to own it. No, darling. And I don't think any of us want to do that. But I'll tell you, I think we have to be ready to do it. The higher allegiance is to the self. Hopefully that will not deny the possibility of meeting. But the higher allegiance is, and I don't mean little self, and I'm not talking about narcissism or the me generation, obviously. I'm talking about the deeper self. The thing we are supposed to be and do in the world. Yeah.
The culture is, our culture is forcing us into patterns like that. Whether we want it to happen that way or not.
Up to a point, you can talk like that.
Elderly women, even without men and men dying off.
Well, there's some pretty feisty old ladies out there. I intend to be one. I think you're right, darling, and you can about the difficulties. And you can certainly talk about being forced and having no choice up to a point. But there comes a time when whatever is necessary, you do. And you're not forced anymore by the outside.
Some people are speaking of the reemergence of the goddess archetype, but also the reemergence of the wise old woman archetype. But it seems to me that that's an archetype that's always been present, but the wise old man archetype, that there's such a dearth of it in the American civilization. So, it leaves so many wise old women, and then what do you do?
You're not talking about the archetype, you're talking about the population. Yeah, well, you've got to be prepared to be alone. Yeah, I think that's true. You have to be prepared to be alone.
Do you think that the rise in witchcraft, religious, that kind of...
The neo-pagan movement
yeah,
you're talking about?
Not necessarily black, white, but in fact is an attempt to try and, not only on the religious level, which is very masculine, but to try and bring that sense of power in a positive form so that it's available to community, almost, which is, I know there's some cults and covens that won't allow men, but there are some that have men in relationship to their coven.
Yeah, Starhawk has a book, or a couple of books. And in her experience of, I guess she calls it, I don't know if she calls it neo-paganism or not, or which, Wicca, I don't know, there are a number of names for it. It's both men and women, but this is a religion. It's not Satanism, it has nothing to do with that because it's not Christian. It's pre-Christian, it's a harking back and down. And a expression in community of an experience of feminine divinity, which can be very strengthening and freeing. to both men and women.
And in your story, going back to the story tonight, I think maybe we got very heavy into the feminine aspect, but the tree also is a symbol of life. And if it's going to represent the feminine as nurturing and giving the first image is that of milk. The only way the feminine can become the nursing mother or the nurturing mother is to be impregnated by the masculine.
That's right.
So you cannot have one without the other.
Well, it's obvious.
I mean, but tonight
we live in a two-sex species, and we can't be at home in a two-sex species without a gender identity. But we can't be at home in a gender identity unless it makes room for all our possibilities.
Exactly.
So that's all we're talking about. Yeah, that's what I said. We want each other. We're not going to.
I think our story is that too.
Yeah, but again, I want to emphasize because I think maybe overemphasize a bit, but it as a compensation for what I think is an overemphasis in the other direction. That the deepest allegiance must be to the big S self, and that I believe is feminine in women and masculine in men, and then we hope for the grace of meeting. But you better not sacrifice or falsify your connection with the self in order to have meeting, and unfortunately that has been all too common. We have to be.
An example of the commonality of it.
Say what now?
Can you give an example of that?
Of which?
The commonality of people sacrificing their true selves to obtain a meeting with the opposite.
Oh, yeah. I bet you every one of us has a story about that. Well, we all grow up with particular notions of what it is to be a man and what it is to be a woman. And in fact, point of fact, what our culture and most cultures have done is divide up all the human possibilities into those two big pots, you know. I grew up when they were saying, don't act smart. You know, men don't like smart women. Don't win the tennis game. That men don't like to lose. They won't like you if you do that. Well, it's very important to be liked, so women tend to scooch themselves down, and they pat up men so that they'll look and feel big. Well, in the meantime, the poor guy has got to be big and know it and, you know, be able to take care of everything. And although that has certain freeing advantages, you're not asked to give up strengths. On the other hand, you are required to give up weaknesses, and that is that can make for some pretty desperate situations, too. I'm talking very crude divisions, but, you know, they've been there. So, yeah, we give up. And it was Jung's thought that was the natural and inevitable and, in fact, valuable thing to do in the first half of life. You develop your gender persona, and you establish your family and your business if you're a man, and your motherhood if you're a woman. And in the midpoint of life, he was talking about that midlife crisis before anybody else, these other things that you haven't attended to will force themselves on your attention. And then it's your task to open yourself to the feminine, if you're a man, the feminine in you, rather than over there, and the masculine if you're a woman. A wonderful beginning. But that masculine in me is to lead me to the self, as the feminine in the man is to lead him deeper. That's my view, anyway. Have we got there? Okay. Oh, indeed we have. And 5 minutes over. Thank you very much.